Good morning, everyone. Tony, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Let's start.
Okay. So welcome to this webinar. So you're in an attendee setting. We cannot hear or see you, but you can ask questions to the Q&A features. So please, for all your questions related to the content, use the Q&A features. And for the rest, if you have a technical problem, you can use the chat. Thanks a lot, and over to you, Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever that be, good morning or good evening, depending on the corner of the world. Welcome to our Just Culture and Judiciary webinar, actually a series of webinars meant to replace the face-to-face conference foreseen in Sicily. Today is part one of the webinar, Just Culture in Practice. I want to thank on Eurocontrol behalf on my personally to all the distinguished speakers, to the co-organizer, to the ICAO Paris office, personally to Arnaud Dujardin and Leila Suleimanova, to the European Railway Agency, actually European Union Agency for Railways, to Kim Drews and Gregory, as well to our friends in University of Messina, Professor Pellegrino, Professor Maria Pierarizzo, and Professor Salvatore Cuzzocrea. Unfortunately, we cannot be in Sicily because of the COVID-19. I hope you and your loved ones are well. And hopefully, threatening you that once we'll come to a certain normality, we'll be reorganizing the logistics for a face-to-face event in Sicily. So without further ado, today we have an standing line of speakers aligned. So we will take until 15:13 with the first two slots. Then we have a virtual coffee break on which I kindly ask you not to disconnect, keep connections open. And then after 15 minutes, we will come back with the last two parts of the day. So the first speaker of the day, if we can come back to the previous slide, David. So it's the previous one, yeah. The first speaker of the day is Chris Hart. Chris is a great friend who realized the importance of safety reporting and sharing of information and the need of balanced approach to errors long before most of us. I would say even long before anyone call it just culture. Chris led the FAA's Office of Aviation Safety before leaving FAA for the US National Transportation Safety Board, where he became the chairman of NTSB. Following his retirement from government service, Chris was asked by the US Congress to chair a panel on the Boeing 737 MAX issues following the two catastrophic crashes. He's a Harvard trainee attorney and a licensed commercial pilot. And in spite of that, he's still a great person. Please welcome to Chris to our panel today. All right, I'll open Chris' presentation.
Thank you, Tony, for that very kind introduction, and kudos to you and everyone who worked with you to be able to pull this off during COVID. I know that's very challenging, and you guys rose to that challenge and did it quite well. So excellent, excellent way to get this together, even when we couldn't be face to face.
Thank you very much, Chris. The presentation is up. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, we're on.
Okay, thank you. You can move on to the first slide, please. So this is about overzealous criminalization. And the question is, does it help improve aviation safety or not? And my thesis is going to be that it does not. In fact, it undermines improvement of aviation safety. And the reason is very simple, because most accidents that certainly I've seen in my FAA and NTSB careers involve inadvertent error by good people trying to do the right thing. And criminal statutes, on the other hand, require specific intent to hurt somebody. And that's what we pretty much never saw, was anybody intending to hurt anybody. And for criminal statutes in most countries, inadvertent error is not enough to result in a conviction. But nonetheless, the public outcry is always punish, punish, punish after there's a crash. So this is particularly unfortunate because the punish outcry results from the outcome rather than the behavior. So you could have a situation where the behavior was horrible, including intentional wrongdoing, and it only resulted in a near miss and didn't hurt anybody, and then there is no public outcry. Versus, on the other hand, conversely, you could have a situation where everything was done right, and then some mistake was made, as humans are wont to do. Some mistake was made, people were killed. So then as soon as people are killed, then there's the outcry to punish. And so punish is based solely on the outcome as opposed to the behavior. What we're looking for in improving aviation safety in general is to address the behavior in order to improve the outcome. Next slide, please. So obviously, if somebody commits intentional or criminal wrongdoing, that should be punished. I don't think very many people would disagree with that. But the question is, given that most of what we see in aviation safety circles is inadvertent error, how do you prevent inadvertent error? How, and in particular, does criminalization help to prevent inadvertent error? The objectives are quite different from criminalization versus safety investigation, because criminalization is looking to punish intentional wrongdoing, whereas safety investigations, the purpose is to find out what went wrong and then try to do what we can to prevent it from happening again. Next slide, please. So there are several potential undesirable results from using criminalization too much. First of all, the fuel for improvement is information from what's happening every day, and that means near-miss reporting programs and here listening to cockpit voice recorders and reading out flight data recorders routinely instead of just after the crash. So that flow of information is the fuel for the improvement process, and unfortunately, actual or threatened criminalization discourages that flow of valuable information. It also hinders the safety accident investigations. I heard in the case of the Costa Concordia that it was more than a year before the criminal investigators even allowed the safety investigators on the ship to do their safety investigation. We have often found in safety investigations that things are discovered early in the investigation that require immediate response in order to prevent this from happening again. But if the accident investigators can't even get on the ship for over a year, then obviously that delays those immediate things that need to be done. Investigation transparency is very important so that the public knows that the conclusion and outcome and recommendations didn't result from some backroom, smoke-filled room dealing, but actually resulted from the evidence and the facts that were found. So when there's criminal investigation, there is no transparency to the public. Certainly in the US and many of the other countries that are participating in this event, transparency is high on their list, and they make their information available to the public. NTSB makes its information widely available on the internet, and that is important to encourage the public to have confidence in the investigation process. One of the things that criminal investigation rarely does is to address the system issues, and we know that most accidents result from people making mistakes that are largely result of system issues that need to be addressed rather than things that individual people can control. So when there are criminal investigations, once they have convicted somebody or even started criminal proceedings against somebody, they rarely go beyond that person to look at the system issues. And I'll give that in a few examples. The worst situation is that it's often a lose-lose, because not only is the criminal part unsuccessful because there's lack of requisite intent to support conviction, but in addition to that, even though it's unsuccessful, it still has all the negative effects on the civil investigation part. So it's definitely a lose-lose, because the criminal proceedings don't work and the accident investigation piece is undermined. Next slide, please. So let's start with a few examples. Strasbourg, France. This was a nighttime landing in mountainous terrain where the airport had no ground radar. There was no ground-based glide slope guidance, so it was going to be a non-precision approach into the runway. And there was no terrain alerting equipment on the airplane to warn the airplane that it was too close to the terrain. On the other hand, they had a very sophisticated autopilot, but that autopilot had an ambiguity, and we'll go to the next slide and I'll talk about that ambiguity. That ambiguity is when you ask your autopilot to descend. Go to the next slide, please. If you want a 3.2 degree descent angle, then you need to say 3.2 in the window, because when you do 3.2 at the speed that this airplane was going, that results in a descent of about 700 feet a minute. But if you forget to put the decimal in there and you just say 3.2, then the autopilot construes that to mean 3,200 foot a minute descent, which is 4 to 5 times faster descent than the pilot was looking for. So there you go. That's the one. So if we had been looking at this problem with, this was back in the 90s, so we didn't have the active surveillance programs of information from flight data recorders. But if we had had a program like we do now, where we look at flight data recorders routinely, we would have seen something that would be unusual, which would be a quick change in the autopilot mode. Now, normally, if a pilot changes the autopilot mode quickly, that suggests a mistake, because usually the changes don't occur quickly. Usually you would take off, you would put the autopilot on climb, the autopilot would climb until you reached your cruise altitude, then you put the autopilot on cruise, you'd leave it there for 2.5 hours, then you put the autopilot on descent, leave it there for 15 or 20 minutes until you're ready to land, but you would rarely make quick changes in the autopilot. So if there are quick changes in the autopilot mode, that suggests that there was an error somewhere, and that would be an example of, if you put your data through an algorithm and say, show me when there are quick changes in the autopilot, then you could dig deeper and say, why was there a quick change in the autopilot? And you would discover this mistake, that people forgot to put the period when they wanted to, or did put the period when they didn't want it. So one way or the other, we would have, if we had programs back then as robust as we have now to look at flight data recorder information, we could have tracked down why the autopilot mode was being changed quickly, and then help prevent that problem, that this human factors accident waiting to happen just based on a decimal point. We could have prevented that before anybody was hurt. Next slide, please. So here's what happened in the criminal charges. This was kind of scary to me, because at the time I was at the Federal Aviation Administration. So I was surprised to see that not only the people from the Air Navigation Service and the airline had criminal proceedings against them, but also the French BEA, the regulating agency, safety regulator in France, also had criminal charges. And I'm thinking, wow, that's me at the FAA. That could happen. I could end up with criminal charges myself if we did that. So, and the problem is, none of those people were convicted, because obviously none of them had the requisite intent. So compensation was ordered, and of course that would happen in any country, but all 6 defendants were acquitted of the criminal charges because none of them had the requisite intent to hurt anybody. So this raises the question whether this was not only a shame to have this criminal process undermine safety improvement, but also wonder if it's a misuse of judicial and prosecutorial resources to even go after it, because you know fairly quickly that there was not requisite intent to hurt anybody. So lots of lessons learned from that crash. Next slide, please. The next one is the Concorde, and you probably know about this. The tire rolled over a piece of metal on the runway that had fallen off of a previous Continental Airlines airplane, and then the tire fragments. The airplane was going almost at takeoff speed, so it was going over 150 knots. I don't remember the exact speed. And so when the tire hit this piece of metal on the runway, high energy tire fragments went all over the place, including puncturing the fuel tank from below. And that's where the fire started and caused the airplane to crash, and was fatal to all on the airplane plus 4 on the ground. So involuntary manslaughter charges were brought against Continental Airlines and 2 Continental mechanics. Next slide. Again, you have to ask, did those Continental mechanics wake up that morning saying, I'd like to hurt somebody by doing this so that the piece falls off the airplane? Obviously not. And that's why the French appeals court cleared the Continental Airlines and the mechanics, because they didn't have that requisite intent. So again, to me, that's not only a shame because it's undermining the safety improvement process, but also it is a misuse of judicial and prosecutorial resources to even go after it criminally in the first place. Next slide, please. Not only that, I mentioned the criminal prosecution does not address the system issues that accident investigators would normally look at to try to prevent this from happening again. So for example, how robust was the connection for that piece that fell off of the Continental Airlines? Were the mechanics properly hired and trained, and were they fatigued or distracted or impaired? And how about the work environment? Was it okay? And did they have the tools? Did they have the inventory? All of these issues that would come up in a situation like this, where we would look at the system issues and not just the individual who made the mistake while trying to do the right thing. Did they also have foreign object damage review of the airport? Did they do a survey of the airport frequently to get rid of potential foreign objects? Because we know that jet engines can suck that in, and this tire event was not unknown either, but the more common problem would be that the jet engines would suck that in and cause serious damage to the jet engine. So were there FOD procedures in place at the airport? So these are some of the issues, system issues that we would look at that weren't addressed because in this criminal conviction of, criminal prosecution of people after the Concorde crash. Next slide, please. So this was in Brazil, where an airplane was going from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to New York City, and that was an Embraer that was just picked up from the factory. So and that flight is very nearly straight due north from Sao Paulo to New York. So as the flight path wound back and forth, eastbound, westbound, they reached a point when they were transitioning from slightly eastbound to a navigation waypoint, after which they turned to go slightly westbound. So the International Altitude Convention is odd altitudes for eastbound, even altitudes for westbound. So when they started their westbound part of the journey, they had to wonder, now that we're at an even altitude, we need to go to now that we're westbound, do we need to go to an even altitude, which would mean either 380, 1,000 feet up, or 360, 1,000 feet down, to comply with international conventions. So they tried to contact the controllers, but they were unsuccessful, and nobody was answering on the other end of the radio. So they did as instrument pilots are instructed to do, which is remain where they are until the controllers tell them to anything else. And so they stayed at 370, and that's when they ran into the eastbound airliner that was at the same altitude. Next slide, please. So for unknown reasons, the Embraer transponder was on standby for about an hour before the collision. And because it was on standby, that meant the Embraer was invisible to air traffic, and it was also invisible to the other airplane, because the TCAS, the traffic collision avoidance system in the other airplane, needs to have the transponder readout from other airplanes in order to determine if there's a hazard. So that airplane, now the Embraer is blind to that airplane, so it did not see the Embraer coming, and the airplanes collided. The airliner crashed and killed all on board, and the Embraer landed safely at a nearby airport. Next slide, please. So on that one, they brought charges against the Embraer pilots and several air traffic controllers. But the Embraer pilots were sentenced to a prison term, but they were allowed that was commuted to community service to be served in the US, because the pilots were US based. One controller was sentenced to a prison term, but he was also eligible to do community service in Brazil. And one of the theories on why was the transponder on standby was because that transponder, which I'm familiar with because it's in a jet that I flew frequently at the FAA, that the transponder is usually placed down low on the instrument panel because you don't look at it very often. And one theory is that it was just above the footrest, which on long distance airplanes, there's a footrest so the pilots can put their feet up during long stages of little activity. So one of the theories is that when the pilot put his foot on the footrest, he accidentally hit the standby button, and there was no obvious indication that the transponder was no longer transmitting, but it was only on standby. So again, do you see any intent? Did the pilots wake up that morning saying, boy, that would be fun having a midair collision at 37,000 feet? Obviously not. Did the controllers want that to happen? Obviously not. So there was no intent by pilots or controllers. So again, was the proceeding a waste of an unwise use of judicial and prosecutorial resources? Next slide, please. So look at some of the system issues that needed to be addressed that weren't: the adequacy of ATC surveillance equipment, the adequacy of the warning to ATC regarding a disappeared airplane, because in the US, if you accidentally put your transponder on standby, you would immediately hear from the controllers because you would have disappeared from the radar screen, and they'd say, what happened? We just lost you. And then you would search around the airplane until you find, oops, transponder's on standby. But over the jungles of Brazil, there wasn't that activity of ATC oversight, so that the ATC did not see that the airplane disappeared. The adequacy of the communications capability, because they weren't able to raise anybody when they wanted to know, should we go to an even altitude instead of an odd altitude? How about the staffing of ATC? How about the design of the transponder controls? How about the adequacy of the warning to the pilots, excuse me, that the transponder was no longer transmitting. So those and other system issues would be issues that the accident investigators would look at to try to prevent this from happening again. Next slide, please. So here's a situation that has arisen in the US and probably elsewhere as well, and that is when there's a crash and it's not immediately clear whether it was criminal or not, and that would be the one where the airplane took off from Kennedy Airport on a way to Paris and crashed shortly after takeoff in the Long Island Sound after the empty fuel tank in the fuselage exploded, and the crash, of course, was fatal to all on board as it crashed into the Long Island Sound. So there was immediate speculation that this crash resulted from a shoulder-fired missile, because this was in '96 when there was active concern about terrorist activity to cause airplanes to crash, and that was after the Lockerbie and other situations where the issue had come up. So there was immediate speculation that this happened because of a shoulder-fired missile. So now we're wondering, should the NTSB be in charge and investigate it as an accident, or should the FBI be in charge and investigate it as a criminal event? And that results in major changes because, as I say, the NTSB is very transparent with its investigation. In fact, they have daily briefings to the media to let people know what they found that day, whereas the FBI, when they're doing criminal investigation, there is no disclosure of evidence until the trial itself. So when it's difficult to determine what was the cause of this crash while the airplane is on the bottom of the ocean, and until they bring out parts, they're not going to have any good ideas on what caused this accident. It wasn't until they started bringing out pieces that they realized what happened, and ultimate NTSB probable cause was that some internal spark of unknown origin in the nearly empty fuel tank caused a highly heated fuel tank which was heated almost to the flash point already, caused explosion in that tank, and that's what caused the airplane to have in-flight separation in the airplane. So as a result of that, when we had a big fight in public view between the FBI and the NTSB about who's in charge here, we, the NTSB, reached agreement with the FBI about how to do this in the future. So if we go to the next slide, and that agreement is that we will presume that the accident was not intentional, and so the NTSB will be in charge. Next slide, please. So if we presume that it was inadvertent error rather than criminal, the NTSB will lead the investigation. But if the NTSB investigation finds any evidence of criminal activity, then they will ask the FBI to lead the investigation, whereupon the NTSB will back off of the leadership role and provide technical assistance as needed. And that's the way it is today. And that has worked very well for us to give the primacy to the safety investigation and let the safety investigators find evidence of criminal wrongdoing. And if that happens, then convert it to a criminal investigation. Next slide, please. So here's what I'm seeing in the future. I think there's going to be more of this problem because we are seeing, as reflected in the recent 737 MAX crashes, we are seeing increasing situations where pilots are encountering problems that they've never seen before, even in training, and make the wrong decision and aren't sure how to handle that previously unencountered problem, and sometimes respond the wrong way. So I've listed several accidents here. The first 4 on that list are where they responded the wrong way. The last 2 on that list are exceptions where they responded exceptionally. One is the landing on the Hudson River. Another one is the hydraulic failure that resulted in the crash at Sioux City, Iowa, where the tail engine on a DC-10 came apart, had explosive, the fan disc exploded, and the shrapnel from the fan disc took out all 3 hydraulic systems on the airplane and left the airplane with no hydraulic systems. And they managed to reach an airport, which was a miracle in and of itself. And most of the people on the airplane survived. There are a couple of other exceptions. Typically, the 2 others that come to mind are where they ran out of fuel. One was a flight that landed in the Azores after it had a fuel leak, and another one was a flight in Canada that landed on an abandoned drag strip when the fuel was erroneously measured in metric instead of imperial, and it ended up running out of fuel. So in those cases, the pilots handled this unanticipated and unencountered situation well, but all too often they didn't handle it well and crashed. And that's where I'm afraid that in those situations, are we going to see criminal charges against those pilots who didn't know how to handle that well? Because as the automation is becoming more complex and more reliable, we're going to see more of that situation where the pilots, the automation is so reliable that the pilots aren't familiar, don't have much experience with failures, and the automation is so complex that the pilots don't fully understand the system and how it works and what it can do and what it can't do. In addition to that, in the future, I'm expecting as automation becomes even more capable and complex, that we're going to have challenges, major human factors challenges, when we expect highly trained, competent, proud pilots to become mere monitors of this very, very good automation, because that's what makes people, when the automation is very good and reliable, that's what makes people complacent and they're not alert to potential problems. So I expect that we're going to see more of this problem in the future of criminalization of after accidents, because people will, the public outcry will say, we need to put some people in jail after this. Next slide, please. So not very many people are going to argue against criminalization if there's intentional wrongdoing, but my thesis here today is that when you overzealously criminalize, you may adversely affect safety improvement efforts. So we are pleased that our primacy of safety investigation has worked well in the US. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll work in other countries, but I would think that each country needs to look at developing a model policy, developed with everybody who's got a dog in that fight, so to speak, develop collaboratively, but not in the heat of battle, and figure out the best ways to address important and sometimes competing interests between criminal investigations and civil investigations to figure out the best way to do it that helps improve safety, doesn't misuse judicial and prosecutorial resources, and has the bottom line of making the airways more safe for everyone. So thanks again for inviting me to speak and give this presentation, albeit virtual. It was a pleasure, but I miss the audience response, but I'm happy. I assume I have time, and assuming so, I'm happy to take any questions that might have arisen from this. So thank you again, Tony, for inviting me, and I look forward to working with all of you to help address these issues.
Thank you very much, Chris. Amazing and smashing timing. We have about 10 minutes or so to take some questions. There are some already in the Q&A. There is one, maybe I'll take one and you can respond on the fly. There is a comment and a question from Robert Debord. He said, requisite intent may not be required in all jurisdiction, and so penalties can be awarded even for accidental behavior or systemic errors. Would you encourage that laws are changed everywhere to reflect the requirements or requisite intent before penalties can be invoked?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very good question, because clearly accountability is required. I am totally against anything that removes accountability from the person at what James Reason would call the pointy end of the spear. So that accountability is required and should always be there. The question is, what kind of accountability will it be? The worst accountability, of course, would be going to jail. But I think my argument is that going to jail is something that, according to my law school training, was limited to people who tried to hurt somebody. And we almost never see in our accident investigations people trying to hurt somebody. I think there should be accountability. Certainly, but it needs to respond to the reality that the problem was not just that individual. In fact, the problem often resulted from system issues that individual had no control over. So we certainly need to keep that person accountable and make sure they are highly trained and competent and able to handle situations. But assuming that there will be situations where that won't happen, I think the accountability should not be criminal. It should be administrative at most. And the point is that the system needs to be fixed in order to assure that a similar situation with people of similar background and training and experience won't have a crash as a result of that situation.
Thank you very much, Chris. The next question is, how do you address jurisdiction that use negligence rather than intent as a pretext for prosecution?
Well, that's a good question. And that's the reason I say that the model policy needs to be developed in each country. And one size probably will not fit all. The US model, of course, depends on intent to harm people in order to justify criminal prosecution. Not all countries do that. that's why I think it's important that this model policy be developed country by country, because one size will not fit all. And those are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed by the experts within that country.
There was another question I think was already tackled by Radu online, but maybe you want to further respond. It's more a technical one on the goal accident. Is said in the goal case, was that not connected with the layout of the instruments in the cockpit?
What's the question about the layout of the instruments?
Was the accident related or connected with the layout of the instruments in the cockpit?
I would say yes, because as I say, I'm not familiar with the specific installation in this airplane, but typically the transponder, since the pilot only looks at it once, and that's at the beginning of the flight when the ATC gives them the number to put into the transponder, and after that, they rarely look at it again. So that's why the transponder is not put in higher in the instrument panel in the line of sight, but instead is low on the instrument panel where it's not needed to be seen, and that's also in some planes near where the footrest is. So that's why I say that's just one theory, is that the pilot put his foot on the footrest and accidentally hit the standby button with his foot and wasn't aware of it, because all you have is a little standby indication on the transponder. There's nothing in the master warning that says transponder off, nothing that warns you that you're now invisible to ATC and to other airplanes. And so I think that the placement was, I don't have any challenge with the placement. My question is, should the warning be more, should the pilot be more aware of the fact that all of a sudden this airplane is blind to the system? In the US, as I said, that's not a problem, because in the US, if you lose your transponder, you'll immediately know it because the controllers will tell you that, but that's not true, as this accident demonstrated, all over the world.
Thank you very much, Chris. I see there are no other questions in the Q&A part. I have one, because in the last 3-4 minutes that we have, I will kindly ask you to just give us a view on how difficult and how complex was this task to chair this panel of I don't remember exactly 10 to 12 regulators to put back the review on the 737 MAX.
Well, thank you. I have to say I was quite honored to be asked to lead that. That was a fascinating challenge. It included technical experts on the certification process from NASA in the US and also 9 other countries, actually not 9 other countries, 9 other certification authorities. And the reason I say that is because one of them was EASA, and that represents obviously quite a few countries. So 9 other certification authorities around the world, and they were honored to a person to be involved in it. And I think, kudos to the FAA as a regulator to ask for essentially an international peer review of their certification process, and then to make that peer review public. So that's something that regulators don't often do, is let people look at their dirty laundry and then make it public. But the FAA gladly did that. And I think it's not only noteworthy for the fact that the FAA was so transparent with the process, but also noteworthy with the fact that the problems that were encountered there were not US FAA Boeing problems. They are international problems that all countries are going to face, and all countries that certify airplanes are going to face it. And so this is a good way to bring those countries together to work on challenging issues of how do we modernize the certification process to respond to the new reality of airplanes. So for example, the standard that the FAA has typically used and that's been used around the world is 1 second, the pilot will discover the problem in 1 second and have 3 seconds to fix the problem. And that assumes that there's a bright line that all of a sudden this thing doesn't work, versus in complex systems where failures can be insidious. There is no specific starting point when this failure started. So that standard may no longer be any good. And plus it assumes that the failure happens by itself, which is also unrealistic in today's more complex airplanes, because the complex airplanes have the systems interconnected. So there's a good chance that if one system fails, it's going to take several other systems down with it and lead to tremendous confusion in the cockpit. Because in the case of these 2 crashes, at the same time, you're getting a stick shaker, which is telling you you're going almost too slow. You're getting overspeed warnings, which tells you you're going too fast. And now what do I do? This is, again, because these pilots had never seen this before, even in the simulator, even in training, they had no clue how to respond to those conflicting messages. And which should I worry about the going too fast message, or should I worry about the going too slow message, and what should I do? So that was a fascinating challenge, and I'm excited with the outcome that we produced some amazing recommendations on how to make that challenge, how to make that process of certification more robust And I was honored to have all those countries so willingly participate in that activity.
Thank you very much, Chris. There are a few more questions. I think some they may be more appropriate for Andrea and Massimo because they relate to the interpretation of criminal negligence. There is one question for you. How is the connection link in the US between NTSB and Criminal Law Authority? Is there any agreement, any official exchange committee?
Yes, that's the agreement that I talked about with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that the presumption is that the accidents were not caused by criminal activity, but were caused by inadvertent error. So the NTSB leads the investigation until the NTSB finds indication. And I was actually in an NTSB investigation myself where that did happen. We did find evidence of criminal wrongdoing, and we brought in the FBI, who then led the investigation from that point on, and we were technical advisors.
Okay, and the following one, I think we have 2 or 3 minutes more. Despite over-criminalization, did you also experience a misbalance in terms of assigned resources, meaning more resources are addressed towards the legal proceeding and punishment process than technical problem solving?
Well, actually, if you want my candid opinion, I think that compensation for crashes should not be as a result of litigation. And the reason I say that, I think it should be basically a table that you go to that looks at all the factors that they look at in litigation. And so the plaintiffs would go to look at that table, and it would include not only compensation for the income that was lost, but also pain and suffering and all the factors that you normally look at. But because of the litigation, the litigation itself stifles the willingness to make a lot of that information public before the fact. And to me, if we want to encourage free flow of information about problems in the system, we need to eliminate the litigation altogether and have what I call no fault compensation for airplane accidents, and have that would enable people not to be afraid that this information is going to be used against them, and bring that information out so that we can use it proactively to prevent accidents.
Right, and the last one, there are a few more, but I think we can take them during the day. Maybe you are not familiar, but some issues that they sparked a lot of comments lately in the press was this sentence of air traffic controls in Russia about this accident, which led to the kill of the president of the Total, and the sentence of air traffic controls. Do you have any comments on that? Or
unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that accident, so I don't have any comments on it. But thank you for asking.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to working with you and everybody else to help address these issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. We move on to the next slot with another 2 great speakers, this time representing the judiciary world. We have 2 senior judges, Judge Andrea Montani and Judge Massimo Scarabello. We met almost 8 or 9 years ago when we started the program of Just Culture with the judiciary world. Thanks to them, we can run the prosecutor expert course, and I'm totally indebted by their amazing contribution, enthusiasm, and connectivity with the aviation and the other transport modes. Judge Massimo Scarabello is a senior judge in Cuneo, and Judge Andrea Montani is a senior judge in the Court of Cassation, and recently, I think last year, he took a very serious senior position in the Ministry of Justice in Italy, in Rome. They don't have slides, but they will dwell on the just culture from a judiciary perspective. Andrea, Massimo, the floor is yours. You can switch on your cameras.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. As for the agreements that I have with Andrea, I am going to begin this short presentation. I thank you very much, of course, at first for the invitation. And for all the time that you invite me to speak about something I really like, which is justice, of course, and aviation industry and aviation world. I am sorry for my voice. I'm not feeling very well. I hope you can hear me, and I hope I can
loud and clear.
Last till the end of my presentation. While I personally agree with most of the things that Mr. Hart said about an overzealous criminalization and the effects on the safety in this delicate industry of aviation, My point of view, unfortunately, is so different from his. And it's different for many reasons. First, because I have to represent here the law and the point of view of the law and the judiciary. And secondly, because I come from a civil law country. And I will tell you briefly later on what's about and what is the reason why there's a difference in approaching this kind of matters between civil law countries and common law countries and systems. So it is a point of view that is so different that some years ago in a similar conference in Lisbon, it generated a very strange, let me say, reaction from one of the speakers and panelists. He was Mr. Job Bruggen, maybe he's here and listening to us, who said after Andrea and I had our presentation and described mandatory prosecution, all things that I know that you aviation people don't want to listen to, but that they exist, unfortunately. He said, okay, that he lived in a civilized country because in the country where he lives, negligent crimes were not punished nor prosecuted at some extent. So this is very uncomfortable position, you know, because more than 400 people there, and they all think that we are against the safety in aviation industry, which is something that I can agree at some extent. But what I want to try to achieve here is try to give you some hints, some notions that may help you to understand a little bit more the reason why in some states negligent behaviors are investigated. And sometimes people who are deemed have been reckless or that are prosecuted. So let's spend some words on the history of criminalization of negligent behaviors. Because indeed, it's much easier to understand the reason why a state is interested in pursuing and punishing criminal behaviors, such as willful crimes, as Christopher said, then why in some states, negligent conducts are considered criminal. Of course, even if the penalty is less severe, because the offense is considered less severe, and because of the mindset of the one who acted. But we'll cover this a little bit on. Although we find traces of negligent behaviors that are considered crimes also in very, very ancient systems. Okay.
Go ahead, Massimo, we hear you.
Okay.
It was a short interruption, but we hear you well. Go ahead.
Perfect. So for example, in Hammurabi's code, there was a norm that stated that the careless doctor who caused harm can have his hand cut. So this is a criminal sanction against a doctor who was reckless. But we have to move up in history to the Industrial Revolution to find a theorization of criminal negligence. When society becomes industrialized, a lot of practical benefits are achieved, but at some costs. Technological reliance, system complexity increase the risk of carelessness. Thus, those lawmakers in that period of time, decide to strengthen the rules of conduct with dangerous activities and to respond to the breach of this rule, not with any sanction, but with criminal sanctions. They thought, at that period of time, that giving a criminal sanction for this kind of breaches could have improved safety. This is the point of view of the Industrial Revolution period. This is why some argue that the role of punishing negligence is deterrence, specific deterrence for the individual who committed the crime or general deterrence, to serve as examples to others. If you are going to be punished for what you've done wrongly, so I am the one who does perform the same kind of tasks, and I will pay more attention. But critics have an important critic here. They have argued that deterrence is useful for willful conduct, not within negligent behavior. The individual is not aware of the consequences of his conduct. He doesn't want to do any mistake, anything wrong. So deterrence is not really the reason for they began to criminalize negligence. But it's a general acquisition in the theory that punishing someone's misbehavior induces external conformity to the rule. So punishing careless conduct will fortify the awareness that society discourages such conduct and will encourage people to take precautions, to be more attentive and to take more care in performing different tasks and difficult tasks. Of course, the point is, but Andrea will cover this in a better way than I will do, when we have to trigger the point of the judicial proceeding against someone who is deemed to be the one who acted carelessly or inadvertently. I know that some states require gross negligence, some other states simple negligence, but Andrea will talk about this. I don't want to cover this, even though I know that is the most important, one of the most important points, and one of the things that we have to get a little deep on it if we want to achieve at least a common result in criminalizing this kind of negligent behavior in the aviation industry. Of course, a fundamental role, not in all states, but in most of them, is played by interpretations given by the judiciary. And also on this side, I will leave the floor to Andrea. So we were talking about the difference between a civil law system or a common law system. Just a couple of things that are useful for the purpose of this exercise. In a civil law system, the prosecutor, who is in charge of the investigations, normally, because it's written, for example, in Italian Constitution, has the duty to investigate each and every crime. He cannot drop the case at any stage if he thinks that for any reason that behavior must not be punished. If a crime has been committed according to what he thinks, and if he thinks that he has a good chance to obtain and to get a conviction, he needs to carry on the case. This is the principle of mandatory prosecution, the necessity of an investigation, and then they have to bring the case before a court of law, of judges, before a panel, or a single judge. It depends on the system and on the trial. In a common law system, on the contrary, and we listened to that from Christopher, the prosecutor can decide if that case deserves a trial or an acquittal for any reason. Maybe because the history of that incident or accident showed that really the guy has been treated in a very bad way by the things that happened to him, for example, to him, to his family, to something. They can drop the case. Okay, he has been punished enough by life, by what happened, but by the incident. So I don't want to give him more grief by bringing him before a judge. Not like that. Not like that in my system, which is a civil law system. So the first duty of the prosecutor, as we said, is to investigate. At the initial stage, in Italy, for example, the prosecutor follows the investigations from the beginning. So it's the prosecutor who is in charge and he is the master of investigation. And he gives the police instructions on how to carry on investigations. But we'll cover this in a minute about talking briefly about what are the typical activities that are covered in this in this initial stage. Sorry about that, but my voice maybe is not going to last very long. But at the end of the investigation, the length is minimum 6 months time, but they can be, I'm talking about Italy, they can be prolonged if a prosecutor asks. If these investigations revealed the existence of a crime for which the prosecutor thinks the suspect can be convicted, only in that case, he has the duty to bring the case before a court for the trial itself, or for different kind of trials. It depends on the choice. Prosecutor is not doing all of these activities, search, seizures, witness statement by himself, of course. During the investigation time, which lasts in my country at least 6 months minimum, or maximum, sorry, to limit some fundamental rights and to obtain, for example, some authorization to perform some investigation activities, the prosecutor must ask the permit, must ask granting for to the judge for preliminary investigation. So there's a judge, which is in our system completely different than a prosecutor, who can decide whether to grant the authorization to perform that activity or not, if a very important principle are at stake there. So there are motions that the prosecutor asks the judges. That is. So what happens? Search and seizures, you know, I have to tell you that in Italy, for example, the police investigators have the supremacy unless they find some agreements with the aviation investigators. But of course, if they are the one that have the supremacy on the investigations and on, to the search, seizure, and collecting witness statements and all that. And one of the important thing here, and Andrea will cover this this aspect a little bit later on, it's the expert witness. You all know that Eurocontrol performs from many years now courses to develop a list, or at least to let understand all the people involved, all the professionals involved, the importance for the judges and for the prosecutor at the initial stage of the investigations of an expert. An expert that should know something about the law, of course, about the technical laws that govern the aviation industry, and most of all, they should know how things happen, the reason why things happen, and give a very simple explanation to the prosecutor or to the judge on why and on how things developed in that way that cause an accident or an incident. This is really, really fundamental in order to give the prosecutor the correct point of view and to avoid some maybe wrongful accusations or indictments against people that, in that case, made the honest mistakes. So let's focus on this point, but Andrea will cover this. Okay, I think I don't want to subtract too much time to Andrea, because he's covering very important aspects. And I will try to give him the stage if he agrees. And of course, at the end of the presentation, if there are some questions, I will be very happy to answer to them. So thank you very much again. And I hope I was clear, and I'm sorry again for my voice and for my health. Andrea, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much, Massimo. We move to Andrea. Judge Andrea Montani, please, per favore, Andrea.
Oh, thank you very much. It's not easy to join to a webinar for me because, of course, I prefer to be in the same meeting room with you. I see in the screen more 400 participants. So it's the bigger webinar I never joined. But apart from that, thank you so much to Chris for the clear distinction between safe investigation and criminal investigation. As Massimo said, I am a judge. I am a criminal judge. I do my job. I'd like to imagine that all judges across the Europe made their job clearly. What does it mean? We know clearly what is the just culture field, the just culture opinion. I know very well that the criminalization of frontline operators in the civil aviation, as well in the medical activity, it's a big problem. I don't want to criminalize anyone, but I have to do my job. And I'd like to say, I'm not your enemy, but I'm not your friend. I'm just a judge. And my job is to make an assessment of human behavior. Also, in this very complicated field of the negligence correlated with the duty of care. Let me say something about this. Massimo told you clearly what is the conceptual idea of negligence. Perfect. I'm afraid for that, but in Italy, but also in other legal systems, gross negligence and small negligence are the same for the law. That is not fair, maybe, you are right. But nowadays, this is the law. And my job is to be under the law. I'm to the service of the law. So, negligence and duty of care. What does it mean, duty of care? Every situation where people, citizens, cannot protect themselves by risks, by injuries, as the passengers of an airplane, in a hospital. Who has the duty of care? The one who has the power to protect them, as the pilot, as the controllers, as the doctors. Duty of care is very close to negligence, because some kind of negligence is to failure of a duty of care. So, to give you an example of my job, because we are talking about the risk of criminalization of frontline operators, like pilots, controllers, physicians, and so on. I'd like to speak about a real case in medical malpractice. If you log on internet, on YouTube, Morosini death, M-O-R-O-S-I-N-I, Morosini death, you find many videos. Tragical videos. We are talking about a footballer case. During a footballer match, a footballer passed out suddenly. He will die in hospital 45 minutes later. Well, what's happened? 1 minute and 15 seconds after the crisis of the footballer, two teams' doctor started heart massage and use a breathing tube. So we have two team doctors on the ground that go to the footballer and start heart massage. After 3 minutes, another doctor arrived. He was the doctor of the, we can say, rescue car, ambulance, that was there for the supporters, for the audience, for the security, for the health of the audience. But he decided to go on the ground to help the footballer. The three physicians don't use the defibrillator. That was the negligence, according to the opinion of the experts. According to the opinion of the expert. We are talking about an investigation where a public prosecutor asked to be helped by experts, because it's very complicated to understand what's happened. And the first problem is they don't use the defibrillator. They started and they practiced just heart massage. This is the negligence referring to the duty of care that the three doctors assume at the same level. They say to the judge, I don't have a duty of care. I was just there for other reasons. But the judge said, no, you start to help the boy, so you assumed the duty of care. In fact, apart from that, there is a duty of care. We have a negligence. They don't use the defibrillator. They were sentenced by the tribunal and by the Court of Appeal, more than 3 years. What's happening in front of the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court overruled the judgments. The Supreme Court said the physicians have a duty of care. All of them, because they started a medical relationship with a player, and because they are supposed to help any persons in the stadium. Consider my word and think about if they are fit for a pilot or for a traffic controller. I think yes. But the Supreme Court underlined that the judges, the court judges, did not explain why the heart massage was considered incorrect, according with the medical guideline. And also the Supreme Court said that it was necessary to evaluate the situation of the footballer. Specifically, the information that emerged from the autopsy had to be considered. The footballer had a congenital occult pathology of the heart. So the problem that is the boy would have died anyway. Also, if the doctors had used the defibrillator. And all the three doctors will be acquitted in the new trial. So This case gives us a lot of very important information. First, it's very difficult to understand for us, for the judiciary, the words of the expert witness. In this case, the expert witness played a role from the beginning of the investigation. But no one understood clearly what they said. That's the problem. Who is the expert witness? Is the man or the lady who gives an opinion to the judiciary. Is an exception. The witness gives a fact to the judiciary, usually. But the expert witness has the power to give an opinion. That's very important. An opinion to understand what and why we have in front a disaster or something like that. That's a very, very important point. When we have an investigation, a criminal investigation, because this is my field, this is my job, I can't pretend to make a safe investigation. I can't. I have to do criminal investigation. But open mind, with the help of a very serious expert witness. So the problem is to choose the correct expert witness, the right one, and to understand what is said, to understand clearly the information that is said. So, at this point, I'd like to give an answer to Chris, but it's very important to underline that for us in Europe, there's no jury trial. We have a professional judge alone or 3 professional judges together. So we don't only have a problem, we say that in the common law system, the judge, the professional judge, is the gatekeeper of this kind of information, the gatekeeper. Just because he opened the gate, yes or not, but it's the jury that make the decision. For us, for all the countries of Europe, is a professional judge that open the gate and also that evaluate the evidence. So the problem is to give clear opinion, affordable opinion to the judiciary, and the judiciary has the very, very difficult job to choose the right one. Because also after a disaster, you can find very different opinion referred by expert to clarify what's happening, to give an explanation. So we can say that the judge is not only an expert, we can say, but is the expert in methodology of science, forensic science. So we need help from the expert witness to understand the system where the disaster occurred, civil aviation, football team, it's the same. It's absolutely the same. We have some people with a duty of care, we have some people who could probably fail their duty. So the very difficult is the evaluation in every negligent cases referred to complex system specifically, like, as I said, civil aviation or medical malpractice. But I want to underline that the decision about the level of a negligence, small one, gross one, ordinary one, is very difficult, is very important. Because I have to say, in some legal systems, I have to say, the small negligence is tolerated, not the gross one. So the judiciary has the duty to make an evaluation of the negligence, of the misconduct, to make an evaluation of the duty of the people that have a duty of care. I don't know if my speech is clear for you, but really, I'd like to say that the position of public prosecutors, of criminal judges, can't change. We can imagine some very important law reform that give us new tools to avoid criminalization of frontline operators. If the law permits us to drop the case in case of small negligence, for instance, or in any case refer to a specific field. Just for giving an idea of the Italian legal systems, a few years ago, we had a new law referred to the physicians. And the new law said they are not responsible in case of small negligence. But this reform just died because another law later said different things. But as I said at the beginning of my speech, I have to apply the law. I have to respect the law. But I am aware of the drama of the defendant and the drama of the workers that every day woke up in the morning to go to work. I know that. We are not talking about a robbery. We are talking about workers. I'm completely aware of this. Well, I used too much time and I finish my poor speech in this moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of you, Andrea and Massimo. Some of us have the benefit that been with you in many events. We've been coached by you in this prosecutor expert course that we organize, and thank you for putting some light in this event, which I agree with you. I would love as well the direct person-to-person interaction, but in this crisis condition is the best that we can still be in touch. There are a number of questions for you and Massimo. Maybe I'll couple some of them because they are referring to the complexity of the systems. for example, how the system complexity is taken into account, how the system is looked into it. For example, Chris Hart mentioned in his presentation that criminal prosecution does not address system issues. May we have an opinion on this forum on judiciary experts? Complex or not complex, I think you still need to judge the negligence or not. Before you are thinking to answer, recently we have started in Eurocontrol with our internal just culture committee. And while you are setting up the basis of that, we were trying to discuss a case. And in fact, one of our colleagues brought forward a very interesting case. It's not a criminal prosecution, of course, but it's a case that made the title of the newspaper. It's from sport. So many of you have seen Novak Djokovic hitting a referee line in one of his, I think it was US Open. And I think there, obviously, Djokovic was not in his intent to hit the referee, but all the colleagues were in violent agreement that he was negligent. I mean, he almost, he hit very hard the referee. The medical intervention was required. And this is an example, you may not have the intent to make harm, but you can be negligent. It's the same with the complexity of the system. The complexity of the system may not allow you to do the job as you would like to do, but you may be, judged differently in court. Andrea, Massimo, any view on that?
Massimo, please.
Okay, and then of course add something if we think that what I say is wrong, which is normally that it's like that. But in recent year, for my knowledge, the target is going up to the systemic level and to the board of directors, for example. So we are not, because it is too simple, and also prosecutors and also investigations and also police discover that it's too simple to go after the frontline operators. So they try to understand, with limits of the means that they have, the police and the prosecutors, whether there's a much more systemic, a higher reason for that problem to have happened. So, for example, I recall the cases of, for example, fires in big plants and risk and risk that is connected to the operation itself of the plant. So in that case, the judges of merits and then the Supreme Court went after not only the single the people who were operating that plant, but the board of directors that decided that that plant, even if it was really dangerous to be left in operational status, nevertheless, they decided for economic purposes to have it operated. But it was too risky, and this caused an accident, a fire, and many people died. So in that case, they went after the top of the boards of not only the Italian manufacturer, but the German one. It's a case that happened some years ago in Turin. I think this is one of the examples where they try not to go after only the frontline operators, but they try to achieve a better understanding of negligence that can be within the board of directors and, for example, CEOs and things like that. And they try to see if some kind of negligent conduct can be related to this level of, and so if there is some of the board to be responsible for this kind of conduct. So I think the trend here is positive because they are trying to pursue and to understand, to have a better understanding of the systemic causes, and not only the frontline operators. The one whose mistake is maybe easier to understand and to collect, but if they understand that there's something more than that, they go after and they try to obtain a wider kind of collection of responsibility of all the people involved in the decision-making process of the specific fact that determined the situation of risk. Is it correct, Andrea, you think, what are you saying?
Yes, absolutely. I think that very important could be to have a specialized prosecutors and some maybe specialized judges, because it's so difficult to understand the system, the complex. Civil aviation is a network. It's a very complex network between airports, between different positions of traffic controllers. It's a very I work with you, Tony, from 5 or 6 years. Sometimes, frankly, it's very complicated to me to understand your procedure. So it's important to imagine expert witness. Very clearly speaking, we need a staff maybe across the Europe of expert witnesses in the aviation field. Also, we need specialized prosecutors. We know that in Holland, maybe they have this kind of organization. Not in Italy. I'm frank, not in Italy. So one day, the prosecutor deal case of sexual harassment, and the day after, a case of disaster. It's very complicated. I know it's very complicated, but we need an interaction between the network and the judiciary, the network aviation systems and the judiciary. And probably it's we have to trust each other. I think sometimes I feel that I'm not very familiar with aviation workers, and probably they are right. But frankly, we need to understand, we need a guideline. Give us clear guideline of your work system, and probably the prosecutor understand better what happened.
Thank you very much to both of you. In fact, there were a couple of questions and comments which were relating to what you said also earlier, Andrea, to give you the right tools. One of them, who has the duty of care to, you know, change the law. Obviously, it's not the judiciary, it's the legislator. The other one is, who is, you know, can't we, seeing that the legal systems and judiciary system are different from country to country, can we foresee, you know, a harmonization of guidelines on international level, and then maybe with the ICAO help and so forth. So I think it's a very complicated situation, because we can prepare experts that they will give an opinion, but the final preparation and the final education of somebody to judge from the judiciary point of view rests with the judiciary, with public prosecutors and judges. What else is there?
Massimo, do you want to say something?
I'm okay.
Well,
who has the duty of care to educate prosecutors and judges? That's an interesting one.
It's a very difficult question. So in Italy, we have a judicial academy, a very serious judicial academy, that every year manage more than 100 training courses for judges and prosecutors. And in the panel of activity, every year they study the problem referred to the civil aviation system, really, frankly. And also, it's very clear the very difficult material of the negligence is we are aware of this, and we can say that there is a serious efforts of the judicial academies, of the department that are supposed to make the property training activity for judges and prosecutors. That I can say that. I can say that.
We have just 5 minutes more. I think I want to group a few more questions. I mean, to one of the questions, for example, one raised by our colleague and friend Rodolfo Volpini from INAV, what are the characteristics, what are the, I would say, the features that you look, or criteria that you look when you appoint an expert? We will come back with the role of the expert in the day 3 of the webinar, but maybe because you already, you know, communicate on that during the prosecutor expert course. What are you looking when you are selecting an expert in court for you as a judge, or imagine if you are a prosecutor?
Andrea, no?
Can I say just two things? I think that I think that is true. The best expert witness is the one who doesn't want to be an expert witness, really, because I don't think that we can ask an opinion to people who don't work every day in the field. We need expert witness, we can say, with boots on the ground every day. So if I have to choose an expert witness, I need a worker. I need a professor maybe, but a professor with practice experience, daily experience. Help us for this, because around the local court, we have the queue of expert witness that want to be appointed. It's not correct. I want an expert witness, total independent, total affordable. Maybe without any time to give me the opinion I ask him, but he or she is the perfect one, in my opinion.
Yes, I just want to add something to what Andrea said, and the real problem is that they are poorly paid in our system, so they are not. It's not a job that they want to perform with happiness, because they know that they won't be paid. Normally, they are people who are not actual in the job. As Andrea said, we would need people that are actual in the job. But normally we don't have this kind of experts. Normally we have academics, but they are too far from what happened daily basis. And maybe they have some different interests that they want to pursue in giving us the opinion. So we cannot count on their independence. So it's really, it can be seen as a very easy job, that of finding out the expert, but it's really not. It's one of those things that can change completely the outcome of the investigation or of the trial. And of course, it depends, because the prosecutor has his own expert, the defense attorney has his own expert, and the judge can appoint the experts. So can you imagine the final hearing where they all discuss and they all argue about the correct answer and about the real cause of the accident, of the incident? So it really need to be chosen carefully. And at this moment in time in Italy, for our system, we are not, we don't have a system serious enough on choosing this kind of expert, not only in the aviation industry, but in many other industries and many other fields. So yeah, that's, I agree with what Andrea said on that.
Thank you. And then a difficult and very interesting question in the few minutes that we have left, and that comes from Suzette Woodward. She's with the medical industry and a close friend of ours. She is joining us in many events. So Suzette is asking, what do the judges think of having a caveat on every guideline that says
Well, can I say just a word?
It says that the human beings can adapt and adjust, so they can go outside the rules and regulations.
Exactly. It's very important in a network like the civil aviation is to, I talk about guidelines, because I think that is very important to give to the judiciary the idea of the duties of a single operator. What is supposed to do? What are you in fact did? That is the problem. We need to clarify the rules of every operator. In the complex system, I think that after our speech, we have a very important presentation referring to the human factor in the complex system. I don't want to avoid my responsibility in this, to answer this question, but really the problem is to identify the duty of a single operator, I think.
Thank you, Andrea. Massimo, one last thought from your side on anything regarding judicial review on how you judge, aviation cases.
Well, I think that it has been said enough for today. And the nice thing is that my point of view is that we are really moving forward, and maybe things we're going to see changes. As you mentioned, the harmonization of the legislators. And let's remember, though, that we are in the criminal law field for what concerns negligence, which is something that is related to the internal state. But as you can see in other issues and in other domains, which are related to criminal responsibility and to criminal procedure, for example, we have the international legislators that are carrying on, and they are trying to unify procedures, for example, to unify principles and to unify concepts. Why don't in the future, maybe not in the near future, but I can envision a certain kind of rule that states that in particular in difficult when people are performing difficult tasks, they have to be valued according only to gross negligence. So that can be something that in the future, not in the near future maybe, but I foresee it, and I think that we will get to that. The more we get internationalized, the more all the legislations must be uniform in order to be applied in an equal, within the principles of equality between all the citizens and between all the people that are under the scrutiny of the criminal law. So maybe it's a little bit a positive conclusion from my point of view.
Thank you very much, Massimo, Andrea, fantastic. Thank you very much also for respecting the slot time. We are amazingly well on time. I'll just invite David to put the slide with the agenda. So we'll take a virtual small coffee break of 10-15 minutes. We'll be back at 15:45. Do not disconnect, so keep the connections to the meeting. We will reconvene at 15:45. Don't worry about the questions that we did not manage not to answer, so they will not be sent to the bin. We will make an effort either to answer in writing or answering in the future sessions. We still have 3 more days of webinars to go on the just culture and judiciary. And yeah, enjoy the virtual coffee and see you at 15:45.
Welcome back, everyone. Tony, are you with us? Oh. Okay, Tony, we should be able to hear you and see you now.
Welcome back to our second part of the webinar. David, how do you read me?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Steve, do you hear me?
I hear you, Tony. You read me, Tony, yeah?
I can hear you, boss.
Great.
Okay, so we're all on. The next to take the floor is Dr. Steve Sherrock. Steve is one of our team members. He's a senior safety and human factor expert. He's the program manager for the Eurocontrol program of safety culture. He's also our guru and leader on the system thinking and trying to push this paradigm. Some of you have commented in the previous sessions on the complexity and system thinking and looking at the system as a whole, at individual parts. Without further ado, I will start his presentation, and you'll be in his capable hands for the next 40 minutes or so. Steve.
Thank you, Tony. So Tony, we'll just start the slide set just now, and this session is a session that's originally designed for small groups. In fact, it's designed for judiciary along with aviation, air traffic control, expert witnesses. And it's based on a session of group discussion looking at cognitive biases or judgment biases and how they affect not aviation personnel, but how actually they could affect the judiciary. So what I want to do with this is I'm kind of expanding that session now to 367 people, and it's the first time that we've tried to do that. So either it will go well or it will not go well, and that outcome will determine how good this decision is. That relates to one of the biases I'm going to talk about today. So next slide, please, Tony. So we've got in this, we have in this this presentation sort of an interactive element. The interactive element is that you'll be able to log on to a website to be able to answer some questions. So some interactive questions, since we can't really have small groups and so on. So are you able to move the slide on?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So we'll have some interactive questions that will relate to the topic. Before we do that, you can also, well, this whole presentation will use some of these discussion cards and reflection cards that I've developed over the last few months. These cards are a bunch of maybe just 20-something cards based on different kinds of established cognitive biases. And these concern these different categories in the rainbow colors here. So we have some biases concerning outcome and baseline frequency of events, some biases concerning the quality of our judgment, some concerning our understanding of others' mental states, also evidence presentation, so how evidence is presented and how that affects our thinking. We have biases relating to suspects, defendants, and witnesses, and finally, penalty. At least that's how I've classified the biases myself. There's many ways that you could classify them. What I've done in this work is taken a relatively small number of biases out of the, well over 100 published biases in the academic literature, and I've taken these biases on the basis that they apply somehow to the judiciary, and also that there is quite good evidence for the existence of the bias, because that does not apply to all of the biases that you can find out there. You can download these cards using that link there. And what I would ask is for any comments on the cards. I'd like to crowdsource your ideas. I'd like any comments on the cards, especially any ideas or good practice that you've had to reduce bias, to de-bias is the term that's sometimes used in the literature. So any practice you've had, especially as judiciary or in any other context, to try to reduce some of the biases that we'll talk about today. Next slide, please, Tony. Okay, so this is the the link that you can use to go onto the interactive part of this session. You can scan this QR code or go to the URL there, so ectrlvote.eu, and just log in with Eurocontrol. So there's a variety of ways to do that. So you can do that on your smartphone if you want, while watching the talk. And then as we go through, I'll ask you a series of questions. And what I would ask you when you answer these questions is to answer them completely honestly from your gut feeling. Don't overthink it too much, and know that nobody else knows your answer, and so you can be completely honest. And just go with what you feel. Don't overanalyze it too much, and go with what you genuinely think. So that's a big ask, and I appreciate that. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to start with a question. We'll see how this goes as a first trial. We're all among friends, so let's just see how this one goes. So here's a statement for you. The same behavior or decision with the same underlying knowledge and skills should be judged more harshly when the outcome is more severe, even where the outcome is influenced by factors outside of the person's control. So if you've logged on your device, then please answer either A, that you mostly agree, B, you mostly disagree, or C, you neither agree nor disagree. And we're just going to have a few moments of awkward silence while you do that. Not too many. We've got 76 votes already, 78. When we reach about 100, the awkward silence can end and you'll see the results. But we're not going to show them in real time for a very good reason. So we're going through to the last few, and then we will cut off at 100, just rather than waiting for 300 votes. We think 100 should give a reasonable sample for this and every other question. So we just need 3 more of you. Come on, you can do it. And we're done, I think. Okay. Here's the results. So you mostly disagree. So most of you say that the same behavior with the same underlying knowledge and skills should not be judged more harshly when the outcome is more severe. Small number of you mostly agree, and then some of you neither agree nor disagree. Let's take the next slide, please, to have a bit more of a reflection on this. This question refers to quite a well-known bias in safety, also in the judicial world. It's called the outcome bias. It's in a way, it's an aspect of human nature where when we're looking at somebody's decisions, the quality of their performance, we prioritize the outcome almost above all other variables. In other words, whether someone performed well or not depends on how things worked out in the end in our minds. And that's kind of almost human nature. You know, we learn from outcome, and so that we know that outcomes are important. It provides feedback for us. And when an outcome is known, we judge the exact same performance differently, depending on whether that outcome was a good one or a bad one. So this is the card here, that we tend to judge a decision based on eventual outcome instead of the quality of the decision made at the time. This is quite an interesting one because in many ways outcome bias is coded into the law because, well, judicial proceedings will be triggered according to outcome. So the same driving performance, for instance, will either result in a prosecution in many cases, whether there is a bad outcome or not. If there was no outcome, then there could be no prosecution, for example. So in a sense, the outcome bias is so coded into our human nature that we've coded it into the law. But in another sense, we know that it doesn't really make much sense because many of the aspects of context that determine an outcome are outside of our immediate control. And that's systems theory. We know that there is not a direct linear one-to-one relationship between our outcome very often and the effect. But that's quite a complicated way of looking at things. And so we sort of simplify it, both in our reasoning and in some senses in the law as well. So the question is, how can we reduce the influence of knowledge of outcome on our decisions about a person's performance? And there are ways to do that. beyond the scope of this this talk in terms of the experimental studies. But what I would like to know is, what is your experience of doing that? Have you, as a member of the judiciary or as in any other role, had experience of actually trying to do that? And if you have, then email me at the email address at the bottom of the screen there to share your experience. And maybe on the back of these cards, when we go beyond the prototype version, some of your experience can be included, crowdsourced into this. Anyway, enough from me. Back to you, Tony, if you can go to the next slide, please. Harmful actions are worse than equally harmful omissions. Do you mostly agree with that statement? Do you mostly disagree with that statement? Or do you neither agree nor disagree? Maybe you don't know, maybe you're neutral. Harmful actions are worse than equally harmful omissions. Actions we sometimes call commission, that you're actually doing something, you're making an act. Omissions, you're not doing something for various reasons. The vote's coming in thick and fast, and we're about up to 100, and that should do us for the purpose of this demonstration. Mostly you disagree, so most of you, but not, let's say it's only, I can't quite see it because it's covered up, 50% of you say that harmful actions are not worse than equally harmful omissions, whereas a third of you, so this one is interesting because it's less contentious, it's more contentious rather than the first question, and then some of you are not really sure about this. Now, if we go to the next slide, please, Tony, if you think back to the talk about the, we were talking there about the young footballer and the duty of care from the clinicians who commenced treatment and therefore acted and had a duty of care, but did not enact that duty of care entirely correctly. We can see here there's an interesting case, because what would have happened then if they'd have done nothing? Maybe the outcome could have even been more severe. Well, we have a natural human tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful omissions. There's all sorts of reasons for that. So actions are more, they're more visible. So they tend to be seen as more harmful. Apology for the typo in that card there. But we also have a tendency to like to maintain the status quo. And sometimes by doing nothing, we see that we're maintaining the status quo unless we have some kind of compelling psychological reason to intervene. An example now with COVID would be, for instance, to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. You know, which would we see as the more harmful, to omit or to do? So the question I would have for you is, how can we see actions and omissions as equivalent, if they are so, rather than as fundamentally different? Because if we don't do so, then it creates a sort of moral pressure for people to do nothing rather than to do something, when to do something, even if it's to do something wrong, is the morally correct, perhaps, thing to do. So send your experience into me at that email address that you can see there, your ideas, your good practice, anything that you've tried. On to the next slide, please, Tony. So another question for you: given the same training and information about a case, others would interpret information in the same way and make approximately the same judgments. So other people generally, given the same information and the same training, when looking at any kind of judicial case, people would make the same sorts of judgments, given the same training and the same information. Do you mostly agree? Do you mostly disagree? Do you neither agree nor disagree? And we're up to 100. Rapidly. And you're about split. You're not sure. I mean, logically, we might think that, well, if everyone has the same training and everyone has the same information when we're looking at a trial or any kind of legal case, then people should interpret information in the same way and make the same sorts of judgments. at least to think that this would be true would give us some kind of balm for, you know, our sense of well-being, that people make, let's say, rational decisions. Let's look at the bias on the next slide, please. Well, this is a bias called naive realism, that we tend to think that we are objective. We especially think that we're objective, but in fact we're not, which should stand to reason, really. But we sometimes believe that our worldview is objective, and we think that others will interpret information with the same view as us. Now, if their view differs, we think that they must be thinking irrationally. But in reality, we just interpret the world differently. We create a subjective world, because the world is not necessarily an objective place. Partly what we do is we treat knowledge as we treat perception. So I'm sitting behind a computer and I can perceive this computer is real. And something in my head, an object in my head, I might also perceive as real, a worldview, an opinion. And because it's mine, I perceive it to be more or less objective. So the question then is, how can we actually take into account our own subjectivity? And there are, again, perhaps a variety of ways of doing that, by getting different perspectives from different people with different worldviews, and to create an environment where it's safe for them to express their worldviews. But this is a bias that we're all subject to. So I read a paper earlier on where the person was doing a critique of safety too, also, and safety differently, different perspectives on safety. And he put at the beginning of this critique that this was a neutral review. And of course, it was anything but a neutral review. And it was interesting, the person was a psychologist as well. So none of us is immune from this idea that we are somehow objective, and we're certainly more objective than other people. So next slide, please, Tony. Okay, another question for you. Compared to others in my profession, my judgments are better than average. I mostly agree, I mostly disagree, or I neither agree nor disagree. We're up to 100 votes very quickly, even more.
Amazingly fast.
Yes, you're getting faster. It's because everybody wants to be counted now and not cut off before the time, which is quite right, I think. Anyway, what do you think about this? Mostly you neither agree nor disagree. I'm wondering how honest you're all being here, but I'm not going to call any of you out individually. Mostly you neither agree nor disagree. Some of you mostly agree, and an equal number almost mostly disagree. Anyway, we have probably the finest aviation, judicial, human factors, safety specialists on the planet. So you should mostly agree. I think you're all being humble, but let's have a look at the bias, Tony. This is, you've got it. So this is called the overconfidence effect. That we tend to be overconfident in the accuracy of our own judgments. So we tend to overestimate our own performance, be overconfident that we know the truth, and believe ourselves to be better than others or better than average. And those are the three traits of this overconfidence effect, which are overestimation of our own performance, overplacement of our own performance relative to others, and over precision in expressing unwarranted certainty in the accuracy of our judgments. Again, obviously something that affects the judiciary, because you have to have, beyond reasonable doubt, as we say in the UK, about somebody's guilt or otherwise. The question again is that I would like to ask you to give feedback on is, how can we moderate our own confidence in our judgments? And there are various techniques for doing so. I'd like to know what you've tried, while still being able to make decisions, because we have to have reasonable confidence, but not too much confidence, of course. So that's that particular bias card. On to the next survey question, please. What do you think about this based on your gut feeling? Based on your gut feeling. Repeating a statement multiple times has no effect on whether people believe it's truthful. Do you mostly agree? Do you mostly disagree? Or do you neither agree nor disagree?
Wow, quite fast.
Let's see the results. You mostly disagree. So you mostly disagree. What you're saying is that repeating a statement multiple times does have an effect on people believing it's truthful or not. And you would be right according to the laws of psychology. And politicians know this very well. And now that you know it very well, because they use this as they think towards their advantage. So the next slide, please. This is called illusory truth effect. Illusory truth effect, where we tend to believe that a statement is true if it's been stated multiple times. Politicians understand this one very well and use it to their advantage, without naming names, but you know who I mean. And before him, Napoleon reportedly said that there's only one figure in rhetoric of serious importance, and that is repetition. So the more that you repeat something, even if it's false, the more people will tend to believe it. It's also been demonstrated during prosecutions, or especially during police inquiries, where false statements, evidence has been presented to accused people who end up with false memories, believing that this is actually true, simply because something has been repeated to them so many times that even they start to question their own sanity and their own reality. So how can we get around it? What can we actually do so that familiarity does not breed truthfulness, and so that repetition does not have any impact on our perception of truth? How can we do that? One reason why repetition does affect truthfulness or perceived truthfulness is because it reduces our information processing burden. And so that's we have a tendency to want to reduce our difficulty of thinking, and just simple repetition makes things easier for us. So we have to try to avoid that. Okay, your feedback, please, again on that final question. Send me any email with any experience that you have. And the next question, please, Tony. Okay, framing the same information positively, e.g. 1 in 10 chance of winning, or negatively, e.g. 9 in 10 chances of losing, has no effect on people's judgment. What do you think about that from your gut? Do you mostly agree? Do you mostly disagree? Do you neither agree nor disagree? You really have no strong opinion. You're not sure. You don't know. And the next, I think we can have the results now, Tony. So you mostly disagree. So you think that framing has some effect, the vast majority of you, and therefore, if we go to the next slide, you've probably heard of or are familiar in some sense with the framing effect, which is very well established from Tversky and Kahneman, 1981, I think. Israeli researchers at the time found this framing effect in statistical judgment, that we tend to draw different conclusions from the exact same information, just depending on how it's presented or framed. So especially if it's presented positively or if it's presented negatively. So related maybe to opportunity or to risk, relating to what went well versus what went wrong, related to what people did versus what they did not do, for instance. All of these kind of things can play out in judicial proceedings and also in safety analyses and evaluations, of course. And they can lead to very different judgments, and this has been demonstrated time again in experimental evidence of all different kinds. So how can we moderate the effect of framing, and how can we prevent framing being used either by prosecution or defense, by whoever? How can we prevent inappropriate framing to be used to influence a judge or jury? So how can we moderate this? Question to you, I don't have all of the answers, but you probably have some experience of it. And if you do, send me your ideas, please, to that email address. Next slide, please, Tony. When presented with new evidence, other people revise their beliefs accordingly. So people generally, other people, when presented with new evidence, people revise their beliefs accordingly. Do you mostly agree? Do you mostly disagree? Or do you neither agree nor disagree? Thinking about other people. Okay. And we have again, a much more equal split than previously, that most people agree that when presented with new evidence that people do revise their beliefs accordingly, but that's quite evenly split. So there's no clear answer on this one, which is interesting. So let's go to the next question, please, Tony. Almost the same question, just slightly differently now. So when presented with new evidence, do you, as a person, as an individual, revise your beliefs accordingly? When presented with new evidence, do you revise your beliefs accordingly in good time and so on, in accordance with the evidence that you find? And we've probably got enough of a sample there. Thank you. Now we can see the difference. So most of you now think that when presented with new evidence, you do revise your beliefs accordingly, and I think I would say the same. So most of you agree with that. So that's interesting then, that we think that each of us does revise our beliefs accordingly when presented with new evidence, but we think that everybody else does. So somebody's not telling the whole story. Let's have a look at this bias on the next slide, please, Tony. So this is called conservatism, this bias, or this tendency to revise our beliefs insufficiently when presented with new evidence. Often in terms of time, it takes us much longer to get used to this new evidence. Now that a new idea has entered our mind, we've kind of got to get rid of the old idea, and that takes a little bit of time because we've become quite attached to it in many cases. So yes, there's an update lag in our updating of our views, but how can we actually present new evidence and updated information and perhaps take new information into account? Again, this has huge implications for trials, because what does it mean? Well, it means that perhaps the early arguments that are presented in a trial that people have responded to by forming opinions may have a disproportionate effect on a judge or on a jury compared to later arguments presented later in the trial, and that in itself is another specific bias. The next card, please, or the next slide, please, Tony. And we're going to finish soon, by the way, because probably you're getting fed up of me making you do all this work. I perform better than my average most of the time. Do you mostly agree? For you, do you mostly disagree? Do you neither agree nor disagree? We can let this one run a little while, I think. Do you perform better than your average most of the time? That's probably enough, Tony. That's probably almost as many people who are logged in. Let's see. Do you perform better? Well, this is really interesting. So a third of you think that you perform better than average, your average, most of the time. 26% of you say no, and 39% of you neither agree nor disagree. Well, this is my own trick. This is my trick on you, unfortunately, because all of us perform better or worse than our average half of the time. On any measure of performance, each of us performs below our own average half of the time, and also better half of the time. So you could say there's a sort of objective answer, but we don't like to think like that. We think that we always are performing better than our average on any particular measure. Now, that's the last question. There's no particular bias here, except that it relates to some of the others. And you can download these cards on this link there, that bit.ly/37 capital M OW capital P capital Q. So you can download them directly. They're a prototype, including typos and so on, as you've seen. Would like your views on some of the, what we sometimes call debiasing strategies that you've used to respond to the last question on each card. If you'd like to send some of those to us, then they could be possibly integrated into the cards, perhaps on the back of the cards. That's for the version 2. And other than that, I thank you for your participation and for your kind attention, and for any questions that you may have that I will direct you to others probably to answer. So thank you very much. Back to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Steve. Smashing, as always. Very interesting and very intriguing presentation. So let me open the Q&A.
Tony, David here. If you could just move your mic a little bit so we can hear you better. Thanks.
We'll try. Is it better? Not really. Right. Any questions to Steve? We have a few minutes that we can use.
I kept them all busy with the questions, Tony. That was a very deliberate strategy to stop very difficult, taxing questions at the end of the day for me.
Good. So always crystal clear, and actually keeps us very much in time, because you know, our time span of attention when you are on webinars is about 2 hours. We're above that timing, and we hope to make it not too long until 4:30. So last call. Any other questions? If not, we'll move. Okay. So Mercedes with OCTA in Spain, the Air Traffic Control Association, is asking any strategies for prosecutors to perform in trial this type of.
Yeah, that's my question back to you, really. There are lots of strategies from different strands of experimental evidence in so-called debiasing, not just training, but also in behavioral economics, nudge theory, some from cognitive science, from anthropology, from different strands. The problem is some of these sources of evidence come from experimental studies, so it's quite hard to generalize to other populations, such as judiciary. So that's quite difficult. We've not got so many naturalistic studies, but what I do think is that judiciary have their own ways of dealing with some of these, because judiciary they are aware of some of these biases at least. And so what I would like to do is to crowdsource their experience, cross-check that where possible against the theory and against the evidence of experimental, and then incorporate that into the cards. So that's my intention.
Regarding the bias, there's another question. Regarding the biases, are there any differences regarding various domains, I guess, from aviation to healthcare to maritime to judiciary?
Well, the evidence for these biases has come from lots of different experimental studies. Some biases have much more evidence than others. My own view, when I did my PhD on human error more than 20 years ago, I looked for evidence of these sorts of biases in air traffic controller performance and found very little. One of my conclusions is that they are more relevant, in a sense, in many ways, the more time that you have to make a decision. Because if you've got more time, then you've got more chance and opportunity to sort of debias yourself by getting multiple perspectives, by getting more information, by delaying your decision, by getting feedback and so on. But for the likes of an air traffic controller, making decisions in the time frame of seconds rather than hours or days or even weeks, such as a judiciary, I think the relevance of the bias is much more limited. But for judiciary, I think these biases have a huge relevance and a huge significance. Not all of them. The ones that I've chosen are the ones that I view to be the most significant.
How the people can do with the unconscious biases? You are not aware that you are biased. How you can mitigate them?
This has been a big source of debate in the literature, because initially was not very much evidence that debiasing training worked. But the first thing is the unconscious can be made conscious, and you can see this if you, for instance, when you're doing training in something like counseling or psychotherapy, as I did some years ago, you will do videotaping of yourself. And some of your unconscious habits, like stuttering or umming and ahhing or gesturing in a certain way, they become conscious. And so you do become aware of them. And so it is possible to make the unconscious conscious if you have feedback. So that's the first thing. To know that these biases exist is not enough. We have to spend time reflecting on them, discussing them, and thinking for each different kind of bias that's really relevant, what might be some useful ways to actually reduce the impact of the bias. And there is experimental evidence of reducing the impact by 20 to 30% for some biases, which is not bad.
Yeah, there is a further comment and question from Cengiz. He said, for example, should every key risk decision made by a board be challenged by counter-arguments positioned before a final decision is made? I guess alluding to the biases.
Well, there should always be counter-arguments for any major decision, I think. And in a sense, that's what's going on in the courtroom. And then as you go up through different superior courts, that's what's happening again. So multiple perspectives is generally, almost always, at least for very subjective issues, is a good idea, and it has to go through, especially decisions that have huge impacts on somebody's liberty, have to go through multiple rounds of challenge, and that is what happens in a courtroom, I suppose.
There is one more question regarding the experts and the reliability of data. Would not be relying more on data than experts? And what about relying on artificial intelligence? They will not be biased, or artificial intelligence can be biased?
I'm going to leave that one to any of the artificial intelligence specialists, recognizing my own lack of, real understanding of that. Because if I was to give you, an answer, I might be going into the overconfidence effect. So I'll hit that one into the long grass, I'm afraid.
Can training be used to mitigate biases?
Yeah, it can. As I mentioned earlier, there's evidence for the usefulness of debiasing training in some circumstances. You can get individual feedback, but this is just emerging. This is just emerging evidence. The problem is it does depend probably on the population that you're dealing with, the people that you're dealing with. But with judiciary, for instance, there's no reason why you can't have discussions to reduce training, to reduce bias, using typical cases and using feedback mechanisms. So it certainly can. It has to be adapted to the knowledge and the experience of the people that you're trying to debias, so to speak.
And one last one, and then we'll allow you to rest. Is there, it's an intriguing one and somehow funny because it leads to regulation environment. Is it any correlation? Sorry, it's jumping because people are adding questions. Is there a correlation between the effect of biases and standardized regulated environment? Less standardization means less biases?
Not really sure what how those two correlate or associate. So somebody else can answer that one in the box there. It might just be that my brain has now fatigued, and I'm unable to give a coherent answer to that. But someone in the chat box will have a good answer, I'm sure, to that question.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Right, now it leads to me to conclude with a small session of this webinar titled Launch of the Just Culture Manifesto. Let me start sharing my screen with you. It's a very intriguing name, so I'll give you a short story about this manifesto. This is a product, again, somehow branded Mark Steve Shorrock, but he brought this idea to the Just Culture Task Force. And every now and then, this Eurocontrol Just Culture Task Force, with an interesting mix of aviation people, pilots, controllers, safety experts, psychologists, railway people, health and care, judiciary, they come and develop a product to shed more lights or put some stones at the building, which is called Just Culture. And one of these products is Manifesto. So I invite you, because you have the mobile phones used to answer to Steve. I've just closed the session and reopened. So again, scan this QR code, because we are reconnecting to just one question. I promise there will be not too many questions. Or log into the website called ectrlvote.eu with the password Eurocontrol. So I think the easiest way is to scan. I'll do it myself. I'll scan it as well. And once you are in, we'll proceed. So my very first question to you is, what is a manifesto? If you will just find a synonym of one word, what is in your view a manifesto? Intent, statement, future, declaration, links to the vision, a message, a carta, a notification, something that goes public, beliefs, ideals, opinions, constitution, revolutionary, and so forth. Amazing. All, I think, very interesting synonym for the word of manifesto. So I will just move on and come back with I put a provocative picture, manifesto, some of us coming from the Eastern Europe are very much, bothered by a manifesto of the Communist Party. This is not our intent here. I think the English, the Webster dictionary, it says a manifesto, it's a public declaration of intents, opinions, objectives, or motives as issued by a government or organization. Also, it's equivalent of a written statement of beliefs, aims, policy of an organization, but also public declaration of intent to explain why you do what you do. And in fact, our inspiration was, a manifesto that comes from the information technology industry, from the software Agile manifesto. And why that? So we did in the past some work with the DevOps people that they have an interesting approach to the software development. And in fact, the Agile manifesto is not a methodology. I'm now and then participating in many conferences and developments inside Eurocontrol, and everyone talks Agile, but very few people know what Agile means. But I want to confirm to you that this Agile Software Manifesto is not a methodology. And exactly like that, the Just Culture Manifesto is not a methodology. The Software Agile Manifesto is not a specific way to develop software. In the same way, the Just Culture Manifesto will not be a specific way to explain Just Culture. It's not a framework or a process, and then what it is, it's exactly what you put in your synonym words. It's a set of values and principles. By that token, the Just Culture Manifesto, it's a set of values and principles. So to elaborate on that, we have three main goals of the Just Culture Manifesto. The first one is to articulate a vision of culture that connects with people from all industrial sectors around the world. be them, any transport modes, aviation, railway, maritime, healthcare industries, and so forth. We want to speak to all people in all roles, be them the frontline, support specialists, management, both in private industry, government, organization, departments, and the justice system. And also provide a framework for other people to advise the vision of the just culture. As referred in the just culture definition, and many of us mentioned these keywords, although we didn't put back the description or the definition of the just culture, only a vast proportion of human action is criminally relevant. Criminal behavior such as substance abuse or misuse, gross negligence behavior, intention to do harm, and sabotage. For the main part of people, we go at work to do a good job. And as we in aviation go to work to do a good job, you hear from Andrea, also the judiciary, they go at work to do a great job. So where is this? We have waited for a great opportunity. Once was developed, it was already published in our safety knowledge repository called Skybrary. It has 5 commitments. These commitments goes from ensuring the freedom of speaking up without being feared to be reprimanded. People at work should feel free to work, speak up, and report harmful situations, conditions, events, incidents, or accidents without fear of unfair, unjust, or unreasonable blame or punishment. And I think by the time I would read the 5 commitments, you will all be in agreement with these commitments. The second one is to support people involved in incidents or accidents. The organization must support people who are involved in or affected by accidents or incidents. This is a first priority after an unwanted event. Safety investigation and organizational learning activities concerning unwanted events should, as far as possible, be positive experience for all involved, improving the design of the system, helping individuals, teams, and organizations to grow. Obviously, we do not accept unacceptable behavior. Gross negligence, willful misconduct are very rare, but to be clear, these are not tolerant. The above commitments do not mean the anything goes. Just culture is not a blank check that we give to anyone to escape judiciary judgment. And nothing should prevent criminal prosecution in event of intentional wrongdoing, gross negligence, and for sure, this is a matter when judiciary brings safety. The fourth one, and many of you mentioned the systemic view, the complexity of our aviation system and many systems today. We need to take a system perspective. Safety must be considered in the context of the overall system, not isolated individuals, parts, events, or outcome. The system is the main influence on performance. And last but not least, we looked at the design system that make it easy to do the right things. Improving system means designing ways of working that make it easy to do the right thing and very hard to do the wrong thing. The design process should be collaborative and constructive that empowers those involved and affected as co-designer to help improve systems. Now, to these commitments to come alive, I invite you, we will email these links after the webinar to join us on the page of Just Culture Manifesto to bring your own commitment. It's a small, stone that you'll bring into the propagation of the just culture philosophies and commitments. And we have a sign-up form. Again, everything will be online, and that is just a way of us coming together and showing us commitment to act and not using just words on just culture. So I think that's the last thing that we wanted to tell you. So I would just encourage the Make Just Culture Manifesto our manifesto. Now, very quickly, let me stop here. I will not dwell further on comments. We will distribute actually the packages that will come out of every webinar will be uploaded on Skybrary every day. So we have 4 webinars. The first next meeting with you is tomorrow on 27, 28, and 29 of October at 1400 at Central European Time in Brussels. We start, and we finish on 17th of November with the just culture in the healthcare industry, again starting at 1400. So every day you will be moderated by a different safety culture leader in Eurocontrol. I hope you find it enjoyable. We'll try to answer in writing for the questions that have not been answered. We're recording and streaming on YouTube these events. Again, we'll publish the material and we'll be in touch with you and just keep going the conversation on just culture. I'll just want to revert back to David, our technical host, for some closing remarks and what's next just before we closing. David.
Thank you very much, Tony. And thank you everyone for staying with us up to the end. Before we close the webinar, you will be invited to fill a feedback form. So just right after you close the webinar, you will have a web page, and you just click a link and fill 5-6 questions. It should take you less than a minute. As you know, to improve and to make things better, feedback is important. So that's what we ask you to do. If you have more comments to do, you can send people who've been involved in the setup. Tony will send everything by email. Thanks a lot, everyone. And that's all for me.
Yeah, stay everyone safe. Thanks to co-organizers, thanks to Eurocontrol team, and see many of you tomorrow at 1400 Central European Time in Brussels. Goodbye.
See you tomorrow. Bye.